So we are going to start with the new topic, development of respiratory organs. Now we have already discussed before when we were discussing about various organs developing from which germ layer. Okay. In that class, we have discussed that the respiratory organs, they develop from the endoderm. So the respiratory system, entire organs of the respiratory system is endodermal in origin. It develops from a median endodermal diverticulum of the foregut. Okay. One diverticulum or an outpocketing or a pouch-like structure develops in the foregut, in the midline of the foregut or on the median side of the foregut. And that diverticulum is known as respiratory diverticulum. So most of the parts of the respiratory system, they develop from this respiratory diverticulum and from the splanchnopleuric intraembryonic mesoderm. Okay. So if in question it is asked that the respiratory system or the organs of the respiratory system develops from, your answer should be the organs of the respiratory system develops from the respiratory diverticulum and splanchnopleuric intraembryonic mesoderm. Now these organs, they are lined with some epithelia, okay, or you can say the mucous membrane. So the lining epithelium of larynx, trachea, bronchi, bronchioles, and alveoli are endodermal in origin. Since the entire system is developing from the endoderm, so the lining epithelium or the mucous membrane of larynx, trachea, bronchi, bronchioles, and alveoli are endodermal in origin. Now the connective tissues and cartilages and the surrounding muscles, that is intra and extrathoracic muscles, these organs develop from splanchnopleuric mesoderm. Okay. So we have seen that two structures are taking part in the development of various organs of respiratory system. They are respiratory diverticulum and splanchnopleuric intraembryonic mesoderm. Larynx, trachea, bronchi, bronchioles, and alveoli, they all develop from the respiratory diverticulum. Whereas the connective tissue, cartilages, and muscles, which are in close association with the respiratory system, they develop from splanchnopleuric mesoderm. Okay. Now, development of respiratory diverticulum. How this respiratory diverticulum is formed. So, in the process of development of respiratory system, a midline evagination or a medial outpocketing is seen, and this outpocketing is known as respiratory diverticulum or laryngotracheal diverticulum. And this laryngotracheal diverticulum or respiratory diverticulum, they arises from the ventral wall of the foregut. Okay? All these things are taking place in the foregut. So what happens in the beginning? A midline evagination is formed. This midline evagination is known as respiratory diverticulum or laryngotracheal diverticulum. Where is this midline evagination taking place? This midline evagination is forming in the foregut. Respiratory or laryngotracheal diverticulum is caudal to hypobronchial eminence. Now, what is hypobronchial eminence? We have already discussed when we were dealing with the tongue, development of tongue. Okay. So the location of this respiratory diverticulum or laryngotracheal diverticulum is caudal to the hypobronchial eminence in the foregut. Okay. is caudal to the hypobranchial eminence in the foregut. Now, derivatives of respiratory diverticulum. Before describing this part, let us see the diagram. Now you see here, this entire part, this pink color and this blue color, this entire part is called respiratory diverticulum. Okay, and this part where I am moving my cursor, this is the foregut. Okay, this is the foregut. From here to here, this is the foregut. And in that foregut, a midline evagination or outpocketing is formed. And this midline evagination or outpocketing is known as respiratory diverticulum. This entire part is known as respiratory diverticulum. The free caudal end of the respiratory diverticulum goes downward to enter the thorax, where it becomes bifid to form right and left bronchial buds. Okay. Now you see the free caudal. This is the cranial part of respiratory diverticulum, and this part where the bifid structure is formed is the caudal part. Okay. This bifid structure is the caudal part, and this is the cranial part. So this caudal part is bifid, means it is getting divided into two structures. Okay. Now each part is known as lung bud. Each part is called lung bud, and this part in future will give rise to the entire structure of the lungs. Okay. So the entire structure of the lungs means the bronchioles, primary division, secondary division, tertiary division, air sacs. These all structures are formed from the lung bud, or you can say the parenchyma of the lungs is formed from the lung bud. And this lung bud develops from the caudal part of respiratory diverticulum. The caudal part gets bifurcated into two, and each part is known as lung bud, which gives rise to the parenchyma of the lungs. The free caudal end of the respiratory diverticulum goes downward to enter the thorax, where it becomes bifid. We have already seen in the diagram, to form left and right bronchial buds or lung buds. The part of diverticulum cranial to the bifurcation is known as laryngotracheal tube, and it forms the larynx and trachea. Okay. So this part, which is cranial to this bifurcation, is known as laryngotracheal tube. Okay, you can see in the diagram it is marked here, laryngotracheal tube. Okay, so respiratory diverticulum has two parts. One is caudal part, which is going to divide into two lung buds, and one is cranial part, which is known as laryngotracheal tube. This laryngotracheal tube, as the name indicates, is going to form larynx and trachea. So larynx and trachea, they develop from the laryngotracheal tube. Okay. The part of the diverticulum cranial to the bifurcation is laryngotracheal tube, and it forms the larynx and trachea, while the lung buds forms the bronchi and lung parenchyma. So now we see separation of laryngotracheal tube from the foregut. This laryngotracheal tube is separated from the foregut. Since foregut is giving rise to many structures, it is giving rise to the formation of pharynx, it is giving rise to the development of esophagus, it is giving rise to the development of parts of respiratory organs. So it has to be separated from the foregut. The groove separating the ventral pharyngeal wall and the proximal part of respiratory diverticulum is the laryngotracheal groove. It appears during 4th week of intrauterine life. Okay. Now let us see in the diagram. So this is the part of the foregut. Okay, this is the entire foregut, and on the medial side of the foregut, a fold is appearing, which is known as tracheoesophageal fold. Tracheoesophageal fold. And before this fold is appearing, you can see in this diagram, there is a groove. Okay, this groove. This is known as laryngotracheal groove. Laryngotracheal groove. This groove, when it deepens, it starts separating the laryngotracheal tube from the foregut. Okay, so this laryngotracheal groove is also being formed in the foregut, and as this groove gets deepened or gets more and more developed, it starts separating the laryngotracheal tube from the foregut. So the groove separating the ventral pharyngeal wall and the proximal part of respiratory diverticulum is the laryngotracheal groove. It appears during 4th week of intrauterine life. The laryngotracheal groove is flanked by 6 pharyngeal arcs. So where does this laryngotracheal groove starts developing or starts its formation? So the laryngotracheal groove is formed in the 6th pharyngeal arc. As the laryngotracheal groove deepens, the laryngotracheal tube and its continuation, the respiratory diverticulum, are formed. Okay. So in this paragraph, you just know that laryngotracheal groove is the part which is separating the laryngotracheal tube from the foregut. This laryngotracheal groove is formed in the 6th pharyngeal arc. Okay, and it starts developing in the 4th week of intrauterine life. As this groove gets more and more developed or more and more deepened, the laryngotracheal tube starts separating from the foregut. At the caudal part of respiratory diverticulum, 2 lateral folds known as tracheoesophageal folds grow medially from the margins of tracheoesophageal groove and fuse with tracheoesophageal septum. You can see here, from the groove, tracheoesophageal groove, which is developing inside this foregut, on its lateral side, 2 folds are being developed. These are known as tracheoesophageal fold. Tracheoesophageal fold. Okay. This tracheoesophageal fold of both sides, you can see in this diagram, it starts merging towards each other. Okay, they have started merging towards each other. And before merging, a small orifice you can see is left over. Okay, a small orifice is left over through which it is communicated with the pharynx. So in the next stage of development, the laryngotracheal groove on its medial side gives rise to a fold. This fold is known as tracheoesophageal fold. The tracheoesophageal fold starts merging with each other, and before merging, a small orifice is left behind through which the communication with the pharynx takes place. Okay. So at the caudal part of respiratory diverticulum, 2 lateral folds known as tracheoesophageal folds grow medially from the margin of tracheoesophageal tube and fuse to form tracheoesophageal septum. So in the beginning, what happens? A small orifice was left behind, but later on what happens? Both these are fusing with each other. You can see here in this diagram, the fusion of esophageal folds takes place, and this fusion leads to the formation of a septum. This fusion leads to the formation of a septum. The tracheoesophageal septum is coronally oriented and extends caudocranially. The caudal part of septum separates trachea from the esophagus. So what is the importance of this tracheoesophageal septum? The importance of this tracheoesophageal septum is that these septum separates the trachea and the esophagus. Okay, so you just remember that the tracheoesophageal septum is formed by the fusion of tracheoesophageal fold. The tracheoesophageal fold develops from tracheoesophageal groove. These tracheoesophageal folds start fusing with each other and start separating the trachea from the esophagus by the formation of a septum, which is known as tracheoesophageal septum. The respiratory primordium maintains its communication with the pharynx through laryngeal orifice or inlet of larynx. The cranial part of tracheoesophageal septum is arrested to form a sagittal slit known as inlet of larynx or furcula of his, through which the laryngeotracheal tube communicates with the pharynx. So we have seen in the previous slide that before formation of the septum, a small opening or a slit-like opening is left over. This small opening or slit-like opening, even after the formation of the septum, it persists. And this small opening or slit-like opening through which the laryngeal tube communicates with the pharynx is known as furcula or furcula of His. Okay. So the respiratory primordium maintains its communication with the pharynx through laryngeal orifice or inlet of larynx. Okay. So the larynx maintains its communication with the pharynx through this orifice. The cranial part of tracheoesophageal septum is arrested to form a sagittal slit, the inlet of larynx or furcula. Okay. So we have seen that the tracheoesophageal septum is responsible for separation of trachea and the esophagus. After this septum is formed and both the trachea and the esophagus are separated from each other, just beneath this septum, a small orifice, which we can say inlet of larynx, is left over. This slit-like opening or inlet of larynx or furcula of His is left over through which the tracheoesophageal tube communicates with the pharynx. Invagination of lung bud into the pleural cavity. Each lung bud, the lung bud was formed by respiratory diverticulum, by the caudal part of respiratory diverticulum. We have seen in the previous diagram that the caudal part of respiratory diverticulum bifurcated into two structures. Each structure is known as a lung bud. So each lung bud invaginates or penetrates into the pericardio-peritoneal canal, or you can say the pleural cavity. The other name for pleural cavity is pericardio-peritoneal canal. The right and left pericardio-peritoneal canals form right and left pleural cavities. Each lung bud invaginates into the pericardio-peritoneal canal, or otherwise known as pleural cavity. The right and left pericardio-peritoneal canal forms the right and left pleural cavities. Okay, so these pleural cavities, they are formed by the pericardio-peritoneal canal, into which each lung bud starts penetrating or invaginating. Extrapulmonary bronchi. The laryngeotracheal diverticulum divides during 5th week of intrauterine life to form right and left principal bronchi. Okay, so the laryngeotracheal diverticulum divides during 5th week of intrauterine life to form right and left principal bronchi. The right principal bronchus is larger than the left and is in line with the trachea. The left division comes to lie more transverse. Okay. So in this, you just remember that the right and left principal bronchi, they start developing during 5th week of intrauterine life. And out of the right and left principal bronchi, the right principal bronchus is larger than the left and is in line with the trachea. Intrapulmonary bronchi and lungs, formation of pleural cavity and pleura. With the subsequent growth of the respiratory diverticulum in the caudal and lateral direction, the lung buds come in contact with the respective pericardio-peritoneal canal and bulges into it. Okay. So we have already discussed that these lung buds were formed by the caudal part of respiratory diverticulum. The caudal part of respiratory diverticulum gets bifurcated, and each bifurcated part is known as a lung bud. Now the lung buds, they come in contact with the respective pericardio-peritoneal canal, and bulges into it. As for example, the right lung bud will come in contact with the right pericardio-peritoneal canal, and the left lung bud will come in contact with the left pericardio-peritoneal canal and starts bulging. When bulging occurs, that means the cells are starting multiplying. The pericardio-peritoneal canals are narrow and lie on either side of the foregut. The canals are filled with gradually expanding bronchial lung buds. Okay. So in this paragraph, you just remember that two canals are formed. These canals are known as pericardio-peritoneal canal. In the future, this pericardio-peritoneal canal is going to form the pleural cavity. So in the beginning of development, on the right pericardial canal, the right lung bud will penetrate, and into the left pericardio-peritoneal canal, the left lung bud will penetrate, and after penetration, multiplication of cells will take place and formation of various parts of the lungs will take place. Subdivision of intrapulmonary bronchi. When it comes in contact with the developing pleural cavity, the right and left principal bronchi subdivide into secondary bronchi. The left principal bronchus shows two subdivisions, upper and lower, that represents the two lobes, lobar bronchi of the left lung. Okay. So as I have said, after penetration into the pericardio-peritoneal canal, each lung bud will give rise to the structure of the lungs. What are the structure of the lungs? Secondary bronchi will develop. The lungs will be lobulated. If left lung, according to the species, either it will be 3 lobe or 2 lobe or 4 lobe. Okay. So depending upon the species, the lobulation of the lungs takes place, and primary, secondary, and tertiary bronchi will be formed. The right division divides into 3 lobar bronchi or of the right lung. So it depends upon the species. If the species is having 3 lobes of the right lung, 3 lobes will be formed. If it is having 4 lobes will be formed. As the pleura lines the surface of each lobe separately, the lobes comes to be separated by fissures. So in gross examination of lungs, you might have seen that each lobe of the lungs are separated by a fissure. So this fissure will be formed when the lobes are starting dividing. The substance of the lung is formed by further subdivision of the lobar bronchi. Each lobar bronchus further subdivides to form segmental bronchi in the 7th week of intrauterine life. So in the 7th week of intrauterine life, further segmentation of this bronchus starts taking place. Okay. So how many lobes will be there in the right lung? How many more lobes will be there in the left lung? It will depend upon the species. If the species is having 4 lobes of the right lung, 4 divisions will take place, and all these divisions will be separated from each other by fissures. If the species is having 3 lobes in the left lung, 3 divisions will take place, and all these divisions will be separated by a fissure. So you can see here, this is the furcula of his, through which it is communicating with the laryngotracheal tube. And now these are the lung buds which have penetrated inside the peritoneal-pericardial canal. And after penetration into the pericardio-peritoneal canal, they have started dividing to form the parenchyma of the lungs. Now, and as the divisions in the lungs have started taking place, at the same time, the various cartilages of the larynx are also formed. You can see the various cartilages of the larynx are depicted in this diagram: arytenoid cartilage, cricoid cartilage, corniculate cartilage. So all these structures or all the events, they start taking place simultaneously. When the lungs starts its formation, this cartilage also starts taking place or starts its formation. Okay, so that's all for today. If you have any doubts, you can ask.
सर लास्ट वाले स्लाइड में जो सेप्टा बनता है वो कहाँ दिख रहा है? सबसे लास्ट वाले स्लाइड में
किसमें?
सर इसमें, ये थर्ड वाले पिक्चर में।
हाँ, वो सेप्टम जो बना था वो किस लिए बना था? वो ईसोफेगस को ट्रैकिया से सेपरेट करने के लिए। जब वो सेपरेट कर दिया तो वो सेप्टम जो है एक माइन्यूट ऑरिफिस की तरह बाद में रह गया, ठीक है, जिस ऑरिफिस को हम बोलते हैं फर्कुला. So that septum, after separating the esophagus and trachea, is left behind just in form of a minute orifice, and this minute orifice is known as furcula or furcula of His. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. So that's all for today. If you have any doubts, you can come and ask in the class also.
Thank you.